So can you tell us about Rusty's world of love, dreams and fantasy?
Hmm. Yes, well, in a way, Rusty was my alter ego, and the stories that have over the years been published as Rusty stories were in fact written when I was in my 20s and 30s. And at that time, I was a bit of a dreamer, and um, quite romantically inclined in the wide sense of the word, romantic, and even for me, perhaps um, writing was in a way a romantic notion. It was something different from other ways of making a living, or I thought more as a vocation than a profession, although it's also been a profession. So I think with me it was always a mix of dreaming and of reality too, because as time went along, I realized the look became more aware of the practical side of writing and um, of living by it.
Sir, is your first literary venture The Room on the Roof? So was that the reflection of your teenage quest for love?
Very much so, I think, yes. It reflected me as a rather lonely, isolated uh, boy. And I wrote it when I was 16 or 17, and it was in a way of work by an adolescent about adolescence, and so maybe that's what made it interesting in a way, because at times it is, when I look back on it, it's in some parts it's quite naive, and it can, in parts, immature even, but I've never tried to change it in any way, not a word even, because I wanted to reflect me as I was then. Blemishes and all. Blemishes as a writer and as a character in it. So it was, and when I first, it was based on, in a way, on a journal that I had kept in that last year in India, before I went to England. And when I was living in Jersey in the Channel Islands and missing India and everything here, that's when I turned it into a novel in a way, because when I showed the original journal to a publisher, Diana Attal, who became quite a famous editor, she said it was very interesting, but it wouldn't work as either as a novel or as a autobiography. She suggested that I turn it into a novel. So I fictionalized my journal. So what remained was some of the characters and some of the incidents, but at the same time I wove a story into it. So it's sort of a fictionalized autobiography. Um, and and it and having been first written in the first person, I changed it into the third person, and Ruskin became Rusty. And so Rusty does, in a way, reflect my dreams and aspirations. And he, and then later, after I came back to India, and I wrote dozens of short stories, again, many of them in the first person, and not necessarily about Rusty, but then I'm always at the mercy of editors sometimes. Then later on, in Penguin Books, one of the editors said, why not put all your first-person stories together, and since they are about semi-autobiographical or autobiographical, we'll call them Rusty stories. So whether they were actually originally Rusty or not, they became, in a way, Rusty stories. So we had a whole sequence of them. So so there it is. But now I don't write. Now I do write in the first person a lot. But now I differentiate. Either I'm writing fiction, or I'm writing non-fiction, a memoir or autobiography. So I'm not mixing the two. The fiction, of course, is always a mixture with every writer, but So the non-fiction is perhaps the true story. But sometimes you can tell more in fiction than in non-fiction. Maybe you can say more. The nice thing about now, at my age, in writing a memoir is that, or anything autobiographical, is that strangely enough, the material is almost endless because you're looking back over scores of years and there's so many people to remember, so much has happened, and you can put it all down and still think, and then still realize that you've left out this or something else. So you don't really run short of material. And that's it. Maybe my style hasn't changed much, but maybe I look back on life more reflectively, sometimes even cynically or humorously, or with a sort of sense of a philosophical outlook. Whereas when you're young, and when I was writing in my teens and 20s, it was spontaneous, as it would be at that age. And now maybe it's not that spontaneous, but it's more reflective, and maybe more of an adult writing, even when I write about boyhood.
Right. So the lone fox is rocking the dance floor. We can see that. So how has the journey been?
When the book was released a couple of years back, and a reporter on a TV news channel was interviewing me, kept referring to it as lone wolf dancing. So I said, I'm not a wolf, never been a wolf. I'm a foxy fellow, but not a wolfish person. And because after all, wolves are dangerous. They attack people, they even eat them. But as a fox wouldn't do that. He's usually on the receiving end, and is something of a loner very often. So that's how I associated myself with the fox rather than the wolf. So it's you see again, it's more detailed in my descriptions of my childhood and boyhood. Anyway, somehow when you come up to the recent past, sometimes there are things you don't want to write about because you need more space. You need more of time passing in order to reflect and when you're looking back. So there's still a lot. Maybe I don't know. Maybe there's still a lot more to write about the recent past. Maybe the last 20 years or so. So it can never really be complete. So, but then it doesn't have to be.
So you always mention that you're a bad dancer. So what about some beautiful lady has ever approached you and you refused, or
that I'm a bad?
You always say that in different interviews that you're a bad dancer.
Dancer.
So
bad,
what about some beautiful ladies of Dehradun and Mussoorie ever approached you for a dance?
Bad dancer, bad singer. People don't allow me to sing, especially in company, or if I'm in a car, there's definitely going to be an accident. If I burst into song, a car goes off the road. Once, Victor Banerjee was taking me down in his old Morris Swiner from Mussoorie to Dehradun, and I started singing, and believe it or not, the door fell off. I told him it was because it was an old car and he just tied the door on with some shoestring, but he said no, it was my singing that did it. I wanted to be an opera singer.
You wanted to be an opera singer?
Yes, that's right, but opera would have collapsed. That would have been the end of all operas if I'd become an opera singer. And I wanted to be a tap dancer. And now I don't have the figure for tap dancing. the last and final ambition, a sumo wrestler.
You wanted to be so much.
Now I have the figure for it. So I'm running out of alternative careers.
But sir, we don't know if you really have some, maybe you have some good talent behind this, you're not telling us. Might be.
As a dancer.
As a dancer, as a singer, even a sumo wrestler.
Dancing I might have done. I used to follow the great dancers of those days, like Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire, and that was the era of the musical, the 50s and 40s, 50s. Now the musicals have died out as far as films go. I mean, we still have music in our films, but in India, but even Hollywood doesn't make musicals anymore. Very few.
Very few.
Yes, and even comedies now are usually sort of satirical, maybe they're not that broad kind of humor, where you had comedy teams were popular then. If you look back, like Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, the Marx Brothers, others. Very often now you might get single comedians. You don't get. I think those teams or partners who were very popular at that time. And I grew up on films. I used to be quite a cinema goer, and maybe that also helped or influenced me in a bit. In that, before I sit down to write a story, I will often visualize it. I will see it in my head as a story in visual terms, and so that helps me also when I write it, because then it's only a question of putting it down in words and good style and language and bringing the characters to life. So it's not only books that influence you, but other things too.
So sir, how much reality and how much fiction do you blend together when you write your bestsellers?
Yes, it's quite a blend at times when I write a story, because as with most writers, even if they don't admit it, some of their major characters would be based on real people they've known, or they might combine them or try to disguise them. But I think we all have somebody in the back of our minds when we create characters. And incidents, you can change an episode or incident to suit the direction of the story. So things do change along, but at least the story must give a feeling of reality and be authentic and believable. Otherwise, maybe you're going into the realm of fantasy or something different. And I've always written out of life, admittedly quite often about people I've known, but I do change them. Now, for instance, a lot of people or young readers and children, past and present, would say, Ruskin, you were obviously very close to your grandparents. You wrote all those stories about your grandfather and the pets he kept and all. But I never knew my grandfather. He passed away before I was born. So I made up these stories based on the little I'd heard about him and put myself in them as well as a small boy. So I created, in a way, a grandfather that I didn't have, because both my grandfathers had passed away before I was born. The grandmothers were still there. There was a Dehradun grandmother and a Calcutta granny too. So they occasionally featured in stories, much as they were, except that my Dehradun granny wasn't the granny I wrote about, who was always making nice cakes and wonderful things for me to eat and enjoy. She was very strict. She didn't give me second helpings. Said little boy should speak only when spoken to, and was generally avoided by me. Although she was good at heart. And I remember when I was hungry, I'd go over to the old lady who lived next door, a crippled lady who would open her larder for me, and I could tuck in. So characters do get changed in the process of writing. They do get changed, but still they're based on somebody or the other. Dickens wrote about his father in David Copperfield, Mr. Micawber, who's always in debt, and went to debtor's prison as Dickens's father did. And same with a lot of other writers. Sometimes they're major characters. Some said Mohammed of Human Bondage. The young medical student has a clubfoot, and Mohammed, as a young medical student, had a stammer, which troubled him all his life. So there too, he was writing about himself. He just changed the stammer into a clubfoot.
So, sir, when you look back now, there were 2 of your books that were adapted into films.
3 actually.
3.
I can tell you about a 4th too, which never got shown. You see, we think of the successes, we don't know about the failures.
Right.
Not my failure, but the failure of the film. For instance, I mean, the films that were successful were Janoon, which was A Flight of Pigeons, Shyam Benegal made back in 78, 79. And then Vishal Bhardwaj made 2 films, The Blue Umbrella and Saat Kol Maaf. There have also been, I think, 1 or 2 children's films which were done by the Children's Film Society, but I never saw them. But I believe they did get shown. But back in the 70s, a producer bought my story called The Last Tiger. It was about a tiger hunt, basically. And it was made, but must have been very bad because it never got a distributor. It was never shown. And Tom Alter, who played a shikari in it, he once told me that the tiger that they hired would refuse to act. It was a zoo tiger, and every time it got hungry or it was mealtime, it would run back to its cage in the zoo and sit there and wait for the keeper to come and give it its lunch or dinner. So it refused to be a fierce and aggressive tiger, and they couldn't get a replacement. But anyway, they went ahead with the film, which obviously wasn't very impressive. So that can happen sometimes. I would love to have seen it, but never did.
Sir, what do you think about the new generation writing? How do you think that the art of storytelling has changed over the time?
I don't know if it has changed all that much. I'm not sure if it's changed a great deal. Films seem to have gone very much into fantasy or horror, or the use of technology to create monsters and aliens and creatures from outer space, etc., where they can use the current technology to almost eliminate real life actors, and there they don't bother so much with story or script. Whereas I remember back in the 40s, 50s, a lot of films, particularly foreign films, were based on literary works, on books. And some writers were adapted particularly well to the screen, Dickens's novels, or Moham's novels, or Daphne du Maurier and others. Now that's rare. Now it's usually a screenplay written specifically for a certain type of film, a Spider-Man or some um, superhero, and I think a lot of wishful thinking goes into them. Um, but books, literature, they used to get all kinds of writing. I don't read novels as much as I used to. Um, I, I read more of maybe biographies and history if it's not too academic. I like to still enjoy detective novels and crime fiction. So I read quite widely, even the newspaper, from beginning to end. I skip the matrimonials, otherwise I read most of the paper. No, sometimes I read the matrimonials too. It's interesting to see the kinds of people who are up for.
The way they
Yes.
give the content of the advertisement.
Yes, it is very interesting.
So you've always written by hand. You've never typed your stories.
I used to type. I've got three abandoned typewriters at home. I used for many years type because in the early days, you had to submit your manuscript typed. The editors and publishers were very fussy about it. But I started getting a stiff neck whenever I typed. So when finally things changed, instead of going forward and into word processors and computers, I went back to writing by hand and enjoyed it. So that and publishers now being more tolerant and don't insist that I send in a typed or printed out manuscript. So I just give them handwritten manuscripts, and they'll of course send me a printout for corrections and things. So that suits me, and it means I have to do only one draft because I'm very lazy. I don't want to edit and correct, as you would with either, especially more so with a computer web, which are useful as far as editing goes. But I don't change things. Just pure laziness. But I don't. I find I don't need to change much actually. No, just write.
So it's been like almost more than 65, 70 years into writing. So
Yeah.
have you ever felt the fear of being forgotten after all the success?
It wasn't a fear, but not a. Often, I suppose, over the years, I would feel that I might not getting anywhere particular, and not being forgotten, but not being discovered rather than being forgotten. Now I don't bother about that. I've just write because I have to, and it's the thing I do best, and I enjoy it, and the rest is left to just chance, and chance gives, chance takes away, and chance gives again. Yeah, so you get philosophical about this: periods of success, periods of failure. Yeah, so perhaps after that initial success with The Room on the Roof in the mid-50s, there was a period when things weren't going forward. But I concentrated then on writing for magazines, newspapers, bombarding them with stories, essays, poetry, all sorts of things I would write. And a lot of that work then actually when the publishers came to India in the 80s. And before that, we were short of publishers. So, like say, Penguin came to India in the 1986-87. So all that early work, which had been done, stories and things, could be collected and published as books. So I had a good backlog of material too, which before that had been just lying there, more or less, having had maybe just a magazine publication, but nothing else. Because publishing only came of age in India back in let's say in the 80s or so. Before that, we had academic publishers, but hardly anyone who did general books or literature or fiction. You had to you had to try and get published abroad, as many Indian writers did. And now it's possible for a writer here to actually have a good income and make a good living from writing by being published in India, because there is a market, in spite of what everyone says that people don't read books, but some people are buying them and reading them. So things are better today for writers in the country.
So what is your advice to the young generation who writes, the serious people who want to pursue a career in writing, want to become authors? So what is your advice for them?
Well, they should know that they can write. Sometimes they don't realize that's important, and just dash off something carelessly. Because I think if you want to be a successful writer and be recognized as such, it can often take time. And I think you need to have a good foundation in language, have a good command of language. Whatever language you're going to write in, whether it's English or Hindi or Bengali, you must respect the language and be fluent in it, and have a good command of it, so that you can sustain your writing over a period of time. So a lot of people perhaps don't bother with that. They just want to dash into producing a novel or something big, and they have the conception or misconception that fame and glory are going to come to you very quickly, which isn't the case. That can happen, but it's very rare. It's usually takes years of.
Even if it is, sometimes it becomes very short-lived.
It can be short-lived, and it can end then in disillusionment. Yes, some writers are quickly forgotten. Very often, young writers feel that writing, you're sort of giving yourself a sort of immortality to writing a book, which is not the case. If you look back over the history of literature, I think 99 out of 100 writers are forgotten, and there's so many from the past who are not read anymore. Who some of them very good, but who've been neglected, forgotten.
I don't know. I feel there's probably a little more writers than readers.
Yes, I did say that somewhere, that there are more writers than readers. It's strange, though. I often sit in a bookshop and sign books for readers. Some of people who come for the book, they might be genuine readers. Some, maybe they come for the autograph or for the photo op. And sometimes they're writers who would ask maybe for some advice or suggestion or something, or they would present me with their book if they've just published it, as many people self-publish too. And it's strange, though, maybe it's the inborn egotism in most writers. The ones who give me their book hardly ever buy mine. it's always the question of this. This is my book. It's far more important. You can give me your opinion on it, but and it has to be a good opinion. That's, I suppose, that's a sort of form of egotism too. Then, huh? But that's, I guess it's the case with a lot of creative people. Artists can be like that too, and actors, yeah, singers. Nobody else exists for them. It probably was. I was probably like that too when I was younger. But perhaps not, because if you see now, over the last 20 years or so, even successful writers have become, in a way, celebrities, because due largely to the visual media. So you become a face, which was not the case 30 or 40 years back when we didn't have television or the internet or anything. So then you could be a successful writer, but you wouldn't have been accosted by fans, as sometimes happens now, because you were anonymous. And that, I think, it gives you an advantage to be anonymous as a writer, because then you're looking at the world without the world looking at you. But when you're no longer anonymous, you're a celebrity, then the world is looking at you, and you're not getting a chance to look at, to know them really. It's all happening around you. So there was a great thing to be a writer like Graham Greene or Somerset Maugham, or someone who could just walk down the road unnoticed and be known by his or her name and output. And if someone would go into a shop and ask for a book by a particular writer, would not insist on having to be photographed with them.
So I'll just ask you something lastly, which is, you talked about a Calcutta aunt, somebody,
Calcutta grandmother. Yeah, my father's mother.
She belonged to Calcutta?
Well, my father grew up here in Calcutta because his father, my grandfather, who was an army, just a soldier, not an officer, he took his retirement in Calcutta in around 1900 or so. And so the boys, including my father, grew up here, or they were sent to an army school in Sanawa, but otherwise home was here for them. And during the war, my father served in the RAF, and he too is buried here in Bhuvanipur, in the War Graves Cemetery. So there is that Calcutta connection. But when he died, I was only 10. So otherwise, I would have been here with him, because he at that time was posted to Kolkata. So, but I was only 10, so I went to stay with my mother and stepfather. By then, I had a stepfather too in Dehradun. But those last letters of his came from Kolkata, and the address was 14 Park Lane. So very central, I guess. And the RAF outpost was somewhere on the outs, probably Dum Dum. And he would tell me about the new market, which was new, and how when I came home that winter, we would explore it. And because he used to take me around quite a lot. So you can't predict what's going to happen, of course.
So you have a Calcutta connection.
Yes, sir, quite a strong one.
Just asking, do you know any Bengali words or any Bengali phrases?
Not, if I'd grown up here, I would have. So I think I've met more Bengalis outside of Calcutta. Because in Dehradun had, oddly enough, quite a large Bengali community when I was there as a boy in the 50s. There were a large number of Bengalis who worked in the Survey of India and were therefore living and settled in Dehradun, and there is still today, but neglected, a large Bengali library, which has got a lot of old books in Bengali, and it's functioning, but not very, not very successfully. It needs, some interest, someone, to try and revive it and keep it going. And I remember, yes, as a boy too, going on hikes with Bengali friends, and we would even go to Rishikesh, stay in the Ramakrishna ashram, places like that. So, and in school too. So, because I hadn't, my first actual visit to Calcutta was as late as, for you, a long time ago, but for me it was as late as 1960, 61. By which time I was in my late 20s. And that took me up to Darjeeling too, because I had a job briefly. And in Darjeeling, it was interesting because Satyajit Ray was there. He was just making this film, Kanchenjunga. And I met him. Not that I was a nobody then, but I knew a woman called Mari Seaton, who wrote a biography of Ray, or a book on his films. And she was there, and she was a bit eccentric. She introduced me to him. So I did watch him doing some of his filming. And we all stayed at the same hotel, and so did a group of a crew from Bombay. They were Shami Kapoor and company, and they were making a film called Professor. And the two styles of filming were very different. So you had Ray sort of filming on the Mall Road and sort of realistic shots, and then you had Professor, which was, they were doing songs and dances on the railway tracks, at the Darjeeling station. And so it was a contrast in filming techniques. Yeah. I wrote about that somewhere. And then a long gap before I came to Kolkata again. When I did, a few years back, it was as a published author, with several books behind me. Rupa brought me here for a book signing, and then I came with someone from Penguin, and I came occasionally for this Lit Fest now. Have been ringing us every winter for your short 1 week winter. So there.